right. Welcome to an edition of Tech on Ice. I just got back from a trip. I was in Prague last week. I was speaking at Update Conf, where it's just amazing conference. Great organizers, great production, great attendees. It was great seeing a lot of speaker friends and just folks in general. So if you're in like the middle of Europe, eh, definitely check out Update Conference. It's definitely one of the better conferences in my opinion that I've spoken at. So with that to do, let's talk about the topic. So one of the things I spoke about at Update Conference was Aspire, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to just talk about how like really awesome Aspire is, like in the grand scheme of things. So if you're a .NET developer, you probably have heard of Aspire at this point. It's been out for a year now. If you're not a .NET developer or you haven't been really following around like the latest .NET things, so .NET Aspire, it was announced at .NET Conf last year, so it's been around for about a year now, and it was made generally available, which means it's ready for production at Build, which was May of 2024. So what .NET Aspire really is to me is it's a developer productivity tool and developer productivity framework to build solutions, .NET solutions. Not .NET apps, .NET solutions. And why do I say solutions and not apps? And here's why. So when you think about building a .NET app, you're talking about building a Blazor app or a WPF app or Web API, right? It's like singular apps. Like they might have multiple pieces. Maybe they have some class libraries. Maybe there's a front end and a back end, what have you, right? But you don't manage all of the external dependencies of that app, right? Like maybe you have a database, maybe you have caching, maybe you have miscellaneous other APIs or services that you want to leverage. So what .NET Aspire provides to you as a local developer is the ability to manage all of those pieces to the solution locally without it being an absolute headache. Like I remember when I first started getting out, like when I was a .NET developer, when I first started, like you'd have to have like a version of like a SQL Server Express in your machine, and you have like a local version of a SQL database, and you would have your test data there, and you would build your app against that, and that would be like your local development experience, right? Like you'd be writing an app that was hitting a database that was on the same like computer as the one that you're building on. I mean, it's not the worst experience, but it definitely could be a better experience. And maybe like at some point maybe there was like an external server that you could use to point your apps to, and you would just have a connection string. Um, so what .NET Aspire really does is it helps you compartmentalize all of those things. Like here's an example, right? So at my talk at Update Conf, like I have like a spa app that I've used to demo for different talks I've done. So basically it's an Angular front end, and it's a Web API backend, and it hits a SQL database. And when it's deployed to the cloud, it's one singular web app because of some ASP.NET Core proxying stuff, and then there's a platform as a service SQL offering that I use. So when I'm developing locally or working on this app locally, I have two options. I can have that SQL Server database on my machine, and I can have like a SQL Server Express or what have you, or I can change the connection string to point directly to the app that's running in Azure. But what Aspire allows me to do is with code say, I have a web app, I have a front end app, I have a back end app. The back end app has a dependency on this database, and everything gets wired up for me. Let the service discovery, so I don't need to have like a connection string for that database. All of the telemetry and monitoring is wired up for me, so I don't have to worry about logging and setting all that up. And in general, like the experience is really, really good from like a developer experience. And then there's like a deployment story where you can use the Azure Developer CLI to deploy to the cloud, and it builds out like infrastructure as code files for you, like really cool stuff. And what I think, at least in my opinion, Aspire is one of those things that you might not think you really need it, and then you actually use it like for a somewhat complicated scenario. Not like the Hello World example, because I think the Hello World example is a Hello World example, like regardless of what programming language or what framework you're using. But if you have like a somewhat complicated scenario where you have 4 or 5 dependencies, maybe you have multiple APIs, maybe you have a front end, maybe you have all these things, like getting like an end-to-end like debugging experience is really hard locally. especially like when you start considering like databases. Aspire solves that. Like it really does. Like it spins up like it's crazy. Like I showed it on stage. Like I hit run, it starts a container that's running like SQL Server running on Linux, and then the API hits that database, and I don't have a connection string in the app settings, and I have a front end, and the front end hits the API without knowing like the URL and port of it, because that's all handled for you by Aspire. You can customize it if you want, but Aspire handles a lot of that like default stuff for you. It's just awesome. So I highly recommend you play around with Aspire if you haven't yet. Like and a lot of cool stuff came out in .NET 9, like the ability to like, you know, there's this cool thing like Community Toolkit where you can like host like Olama in Aspire. So like Olama, if folks don't know, it's like how a lot of people use, like how a lot of people like test and build like LLMs locally on their machines. So you can have like a version of Olama running, and then you can have a build your app that hits your Olama endpoint, and you can have like generative AI all locally. It's crazy, absolutely crazy. So that's it. I just wanted to kind of just shout out Update Conf. I wanted to shout out Aspire, and if you're not doing so, please take a look at Aspire and look at Update Conf as well, like for next November. Um, Also comment down below if you're using Aspire today or you're curious about it, and and if you're using it today, like what you love about it. And like always, like and share, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.